From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I first encountered the work of our next speaker in 1981, in other words, before many of you were born, through his work, True Names, which, if any was in the audience is familiar with the genre of cyberpunk, that was the first work to really not only define in popular fiction the concept of the singularity, the melding of a human mind with a computer system, but was one of the most influential works that actually brought about the whole genre and the idea of the internet and the web. I next encountered his work not for many, many years when I was presented with a copy of his book, Rainbow's End, when I was working with a mass digitization project and encountered the concept of destroying books to digitize them, which is not what we have been doing at the Library of Congress with our book digitization. Oh, somebody about the book digitization. But the works of his that I must say that I love the most are his works Fire Upon the Deep, Deepness in the Sky, and his newest novel, Children of the Sky, in which he presents a type of culture that is unlike any other, in which a group of beings exist as one and share a shared consciousness. And the encountering of this type of culture by the human race in deep space many, many, many centuries into the future. Vernor Vinge is an award-winning author. He won Hugo Awards for Fire Upon the Deep, for Deepness in the Sky, and for Rainbow's End. He is a retired professor of mathematics from San Diego State University, and it is my very extreme personal pleasure to introduce Vernor Vinge to you today.
Thank you, Leslie. It's certainly a great pleasure to be here at the National Book Festival, and a great honor to be here. So I was thinking to say a few things about my career in science fiction and where I got started and what I think is important about science fiction. I think, like most intense science fiction readers, I got started when I was quite young. I remember as a child, the world was a different place than it is now, which it's unsurprising. But there was one aspect to it that I'm not sure is clearly talked about a lot. And that is, when I was young, when I first started looking at stories, I noticed something that seemed to be true of the stories that I would see on television, and this was actually before I could really read, so I'm not sure about books at first. And that was that stories had the characteristic that the world was the same at the end of the story, maybe not for the characters in the story who might have fallen in love or something like that, but for the world as a whole, the world was the same as at the end of the story as it was at the beginning of the story. And I'm not quite sure why it is true that this really upset me, since my childhood was quite happy, but it did upset me. And so I would look around to try to find stories where the world was different at the end of the story than at the beginning of the story. And there were occasional cases where that was true. However, most of them turned out to be fraudulent. For instance, it would turn out that the change that had happened during the story was really just a dream, and the character wakes up and really the world is the same as it was at the beginning of the story. But I did find that there was one characteristic of stories, the very rare stories that I would find where the world was different at the end of the story from the beginning of the story, and that was generally associated with the word science fiction. And so I began to search out stories that fell under that term, and it's probably not a good or a healthy thing, but virtually all of the extracurricular reading that I did as a child was science fiction. And nowadays, of course, the world is expected to be different at the end of every year than it was at the beginning of the year. So it's not such a big deal now, and science fiction is not quite the encapsulated corner literature that it was in the 1950s. Although there are still aspects of it that are very much in a corner, and the stuff that is generally popular has its own characteristics. But that's where I initially came into science fiction. I think that nowadays, more and more, science fiction is very important, and it has certain roles in society. And so I'd like to kind of list those, and I think some of them are actually false claims, and some of them are true. One is the claim that science fiction is important because it predicts the future. And actually, I don't think that is true any more than if you had a million monkeys typing away, that some of the monkeys would get things that are right. If you cherry pick the science fiction story that you want to read, or you cherry pick the parts of a story that you want to talk about, you can make stories that look very prophetic. I have written stories that if you pick just the right parts of them, it looks like I must have had a perfect crystal ball. And if you look at the other parts, you may conclude that I was really an idiot. So I don't think prediction really is a true virtue of science fiction. There is one virtue of science fiction that I think that is almost indisputable, and that is that science fiction it can be a very powerful tool to encourage young people to get into science. I meet a lot of scientists, adult scientists, who actually don't read science fiction. But in most cases, I think science fiction was important to them before while they were young and before they got super busy with the science that they are doing now. And of course, there are adult scientists who are still quite interested in continuing to read science fiction. So that particular limited role of science fiction, I think, is very, very important, very, very valid. There is another virtue of science fiction that I think is important and will become more important in the future, which sort of raises an interesting question, and that is how science fiction might change in the future. But one thing about science fiction is that it allows us, not in the sense of predicting the future, but in the sense of planning for the future. Science fiction allows us to consider different scenarios. And by a scenario, I mean imagining some logically coherent vision of the future that you don't claim is the way things are necessarily really going to happen, but you claim it's internally consistent, that it depends on a small number of perhaps surprising possibilities, and then you follow through on those consequences and write an interesting story based on that. That, I think, is very, very important for several reasons. The most important reason is that nobody knows what the future is going to be. But we do know the future will probably be different than things are now, and being able to work on that is important. Since we don't know what the future is going to be, entrusting anybody, whether they are a science fiction writer or a politician or a scientist, entrusting anybody to predict the future is almost a surefire guarantee that you are going to be wrong, because there are a very large number of things that are that possibly could happen, and zeroing in on one of them and spending all your resources on guarding against the bad parts of that prediction and profiting on the good parts of that prediction is a very long bet. So I think most people, whether or not they're science fiction readers or not, should look at the future in terms of different classes of things that could happen. And the beauty of looking at things in terms of scenarios is that you're in a situation there that as time goes by, you can look at public events and technological events, and you can compare them not just to one vision of the future, but to all the scenarios that you've been considering. And you'll find that some of the things that have happened increase the probability of some scenarios, they may decrease the probability of other scenarios, and they may suggest new scenarios entirely. But that process of looking at events in terms of different scenarios means that you, the user of scenarios, is going to be alert to possibilities that you would not have been alert to if you had only had one true vision of the future in your mind. Similarly, when it comes time to planning, like what you're going to, what sort of precautions you're going to take, where you are going to invest in the future, where you want society to invest in the future, those all can be done in terms of reacting to the different possibilities about that future. And so as time goes on, you can reallocate resources depending on what your figure is going to happen. It's not surprising that scenarios actually are very big outside of science fiction nowadays. I think it's an entirely healthy thing that a lot of very large organizations, both inside of government and outside of government, use scenario-based planning nowadays. And it's a lot of fun for science fiction writers because these organizations like to invite science fiction writers to they like to have at least one crazy person on their committees that can talk about crazy things that could happen. I've overlooked one thing about science fiction that is independent of scenarios and is in a way independent of the other things that I said were virtues of science fiction. And that is that science fiction is, it should be, entertainment. And when I write, that actually is, or should be, I think, the top motive that I have, how to write something that's going to be entertaining to the maximum number of people. I think forgetting that is actually a mistake. If you forget that, if you seriously are not interested in entertaining people and you're only interested in preaching to people, that in that case you probably should be working for one of these commercial or government organizations that just does serious planning. There is also a virtue, a separate virtue that's sort of sneaky about writing to entertain. And that is that if you write to entertain and you succeed, then you actually have a bunch of people who are reading your stories who are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. This is called, and you've probably heard the term, the willing suspension of disbelief, used in connection with science fiction. If a really smart person likes your story, when they see you do something that they know is incorrect, but they like the story, they will say, wow, why did he do that? What was he thinking? What explanation could there be for this apparent inconsistency in this person's story? And so sometimes I run into very, very smart people who are much smarter than I and have much deeper background in various things. They'll come up to me and say, oh, I love this story, and especially such and such a point where you saw that, in fact, this thing that is apparently a mistake is really an evidence of a very profound point that I discovered once I was reading your story. You really are smart to be able to figure that out. And I said, oh, well, I'm glad you were able to see that point. Yes. What was that? Can you help me and give me some references about that point? Now, the flip side of that is that if you write a story that is not entertaining and it's being read by someone who is very smart, when those people see something that is wrong, then there's nothing you can do for the rest of the story that's right. No matter what you say, they are smart enough to think of a reason why what you said actually was baloney. This is a virtue that we who are writing official fiction, it's a virtue that we have over the people in these commercial and government committees that do scenario planning, because they do not have the obligation to entertain anybody, and so they've except for a very small fraction of humans who are capable of being smart and trying to interpolate even when they aren't entertained. These these nonfiction scenario-based planning people are giving up a really a substantial advantage that we fiction writers have. As I've been writing, most of my writing career has really concentrated on two general classes of scenarios. One of them is space travel. That's the one that I grew up with. It was probably my first love, and for me, it's really, I would say, the greatest technological disappointment of my life, that we do not have independent space colonies out there in this year 2012. On the other hand, I think that actually, barring disaster, that the 21st century is going to be a very big century for space travel. And I think a lot of the science fiction that happened in the 1950s is in some sense going to happen in the 21st century, and I look forward to it very much. And as you know from Leslie's introduction or from your own reading of my stories, I write a lot of stories about space travel. Not as many about solar system near future space travel as I would like to do, but interstellar space travel I've actually written quite a bit. The other big theme, which to me sort of grew up out of the late 1950s and early 1960s, was the feeling that technology was going to create certain classes of inventions that making inventions easier to do. And that sort of meta-invention is improvements in cognition, that is, in the ability of mind to think. And as the years have passed, I've become more and more convinced of that, and I think that progress is proceeding like gangbusters. And you hear a lot about that nowadays when people talk about the technological singularity. I think one thing that some people don't get about the singularity scenario is that they're actually a bunch of sub-scenarios. One of the things that makes me more confident that the technological singularity, that is the rise of superhuman intelligence, is going to happen is there are these different ways that it could happen. It could happen the way we perhaps originally imagined, which is just with super smart computers. It could happen with computers that make humans smarter. That is, humans plus computers. Could think of it as sort of a neo-cortex for the human brain that makes us much, much smarter. Another way that this could happen is the internet plus humanity using the internet. And right now, I think in 2012, that particular angle for getting to superhuman intelligence is really very striking. And if you read in the right places about crowdsourcing and about things like the Fold It project and the Duolingo project, if you Google on those things, that these are prospects where you can actually see that the ensemble of humanity plus the machines is already considerably smarter than any intellectual institution in the world, short of all of humanity, and it's certainly more powerful than any intellectual institution of the past. And it should give us a lot of optimism about the future and for the other prospects of the singularity. There are other ways that the singularity could happen that I would do in a regular talk about the singularity, but the main point is that it's happening in a lot of different ways, and short of physical disaster, I think that it probably will happen by 2030. How does this fit with space travel? Well, if the singularity doesn't happen, I think the space travel stuff becomes much, much more important because we need it for our human survival. We don't want to be trapped on one planet considering the technology that we have. If the singularity does happen, then I think we'll also get space travel, but we humans will only be part of the enterprise. And there are lots of really fun science fiction books you can read about that possibility. If you're familiar with the writer Ian Banks, Ianbanks. He's written a lot of space opera stories. In his general series is called The Culture stories. And in those stories, there are interstellar spaceships, and overtly it looks like your classical space opera science fiction story. But if you read it closely, you realize that the crew, the human crew of the starships, are really along more or less like the ship's pet dog. They're along to keep the machines that run the starship, which are much smarter than any of the humans. They're along to keep them company and to provide a good time. And occasionally they're along because the mines that run the spaceship need a canary for some mine, and that they have to decide whether the mine is dangerous enough, and so the crew gets to go down to the planet and take risks that the machine running the starship is not willing to take. That occasionally comes up, and that's not much fun, but it's still probably safer than shipping out on the Starship Enterprise. So those are the sorts of things that I see in the near future. In the farther future, science fiction, I like to say, is the first occupational group that has been impacted by the technological singularity. If you are a science fiction writer who likes to write hard science fiction is science fiction about things you think are plausible and you try to work out the science in some plausible way. If you write that type of science fiction, and if you believe that the technological singularity is going to happen, then it's very hard to write a story that takes place after that point in time. The Ian Banks example that I described is one way of doing it, but other than things like that, it's hard to imagine a story that has human-sized heroes. And very few people are going to believe you if you write a story from the standpoint of a superhumanly competent hero, because the audience is not superhuman nowadays, and the author is not superhuman nowadays. So this has actually been a very big barrier to writing science fiction. And I like to think that as time goes by and we actually do get closer and closer to the singularity, that we're going to see science fiction itself begin to change. Not change just in reacting to the possibility of the singularity, but change in the topics that it deals with, and actually ultimately changing with the way that it deals with it. I've often thought that art goes through sort of a trajectory. Imagine what it would be like if you were an early human and you decided you wanted to become a comedian. Almost any joke that you would tell would be hilarious, and you would be the first person who ever told it. Imagine what it would be like to be the first person who ever told a traveling salesman joke. You can't go wrong. On the other hand, if you fast forward to the 21st century, where we have, thanks to the Library of Congress, we have very good records of the past. We have records of all the jokes that there are probably records of. If your job then is to say something funny, you often are reduced to doing little tweaks and variations on the past. Think about what Western movies are like nowadays, cowboy Western movies are like. That's a similar sort of problem, in that you have a whole century of people working on the tropes. So one really kind of cool thing about the singularity, if you were an early post-human writer, is that you would be like those early humans, the first human to ever tell a joke, the first human to ever tell an adventure story or tell a romance story. In the early singularity eras, the early post-humans will be the first ones to write these new types of art. And although it may be difficult for us to participate in them, I sort of admire them and envy them for being able to be groundbreaking on things that are happening for the first time, that is in the post-human era. Well, I think that I will leave off there and take any questions that anybody has for the rest of my time. Thank you.
Hello. Could you talk a little bit about your writing process? Do you write longhand? Do you type? Is it 9 to 5?
Question about my writing process. First of all, I should say that I'm interested in that in a number of ways. Like nowadays, I often get to talk to other writers, and I like to ask them exactly that question. And one thing I've learned is that there really are a lot of different styles that work styles that people have. So I think I'm not very unusual, but if what I say is not at all what you do when you write, it just means that we're in different work styles. My particular style is oriented around my peculiar disability, and that is I have a writer's block. You hear about people who've had a writer's block for a whole month or a whole year. I've had a writer's block now for 67 years. And if you're in that situation, it takes a real effort to write a first draft. So basically, the type of style that I have now is that if I'm actually in writing mode, where I'm supposed to be writing, at the beginning of the day, and I do use a word processor, by the way, and I regard it as very important and very useful to me, but at the beginning of the day, the rule is that I can quit for the day as soon as I've written 5 pages, that is, as soon as my word processor counts 1,500 new words. It doesn't, and it's very important that it doesn't matter how bad that writing is, because if I factored quality into this, it wouldn't work. So no matter how bad it is, as soon as I can write 1,500 words, I'm done for the day. That's the only thing that gets me through the day.
My impression of the singularity is that the whole idea is that progress would keep getting faster and faster until it reaches a sort of vertical asymptote. And it seems to me that progress has actually been slowing down, that there's been a lot less change, at least in American daily life in the last 50 years, say, than in the 50 years before that. That there's really been almost nothing new in the last 50 years other than internet, computers, and cell phones.
I think that a good argument, the argument that there was more technological change earlier than there has been recently, if a person looks at the right features, I think a good argument can be made to support the contention that you're making. I disagree with the overall conclusion, and I could cherry pick. I could cherry pick to support my contention. I think that actually the internet so far is comparable to the most recent thing that that it's comparable to the rise of speech and apprenticeships in human civilization. So there are things that are going on that I think that are related to intellect and that are very powerful. Similarly with what we're seeing with automation. But I take your point, and I think that we're going to have to watch the next few years and see what happens in terms of speed of prototyping, speed of manufacturing, the rise of automation within manufacturing, that there are certain things that we can look at. There are certain symptoms within large bureaucracies that would be interesting to watch. For instance, if you began to see policy decisions made in governmental and in commercial situations where they were more and more involved with what the machine systems are doing, I think that would support my position more than the position that you're putting. Overall, I think there are things going on with technology and thought that together, whether or not it goes the way that I'm saying with singularity, are something new under the sun, and it's actually a very interesting time to be alive to track that trajectory.
Dr. Vinge, I'm afraid I'm going to contradict you a little bit on your point that you say that you don't predict the future very well. I was reading Wired magazine back in July, and there was an article about the internet group Anonymous, and specifically about how one of the members had been identified by the FBI, and they basically co-opted him to sort of inform on other members of Anonymous. And I thought, oh my God, this guy's Mr. Slippery. He's Roger Pollack from True Names. And I wondered, A, if you'd seen that, and B, if you could talk a little bit about, when you envisioned what we're now calling cyberspace back in 1981, how much of it you think has come to pass, how much you think is yet to come to pass, and how much you think isn't going to happen?
I don't think I said it explicitly in my story, True Names, but I think that internally I was putting it as happening in the year 2013. And in general, except that the interface device is not like the interface device that I had in the story. The real interface devices we have for the internet are different. And we don't have any evidence of the mailman or Erythrina in those two characters. We don't have any evidence in that in our era. Other than that, True Names seems to be very, very similar to what our present situation is and how we have gotten there. I think one thing that I pretty much missed in True Names is the power of big data, in the power of big surveillance driven by big data. I think actually this may be one of the first places where the singularity actually does show up, where you get where the million eyeball situation. Right now it's fairly easy to imagine cameras enough to have millions of cameras in a metropolitan area. The problem being that we don't have a million eyeballs to intelligently watch those cameras. I think that problem is very likely close to being solved or already has been solved. And the result of a world where that is in place, even if the world is a democracy, is very, very interesting. All through the 20th century, I think laws were passed because people would see something they didn't like and say, gee, it would be nice to have a law that's illegal, to make that be illegal. And nowadays we have the ability to enforce every one of the crazy laws that's ever been passed. And I think this, not surprisingly, makes people sort of uneasy. And so that was something that I didn't have in True Names, which, yeah.
I guess I'm next. Professor, when was the last time you programmed in Lisp or Prolog? Me, 20 years ago. Questions. Chess and the traveling salesman program solved by a complete graph tree, doing all the examples. Signal processing, landing a carrier, link 4 landing a plane on a carrier, link 4, parking a car automatically, signal processing. The eyeball problem, and manufacturing pattern recognition. My question to you is your concept of AI that you've written about in technical journals is not the way it's going. And I don't think it will ever go. Everybody predicted it would go that way, but it's not going that way. We're solving the problems I mentioned that you consider AI problems by pattern recognition, complete graph tree, and signal processing. So I don't see us getting to the point of the AI solutions that you wanted or that you predict. Can you answer that question?
Actually, I don't agree with the assertions. I do think that I do agree that I can make no claim to know or to properly predict what things are going to go well and what things are not going to go well. I think one of the most entertaining features of our present era is exactly how things do go. One analogy or metaphor that I use is when it comes to the AI talking about trying to make an artificial intelligence that is a person. There are certain things we can do. There are certain things so far we haven't been able to do. Exactly what is hard and what is easy has been a string of interesting surprises. And in a way, some of those surprises where there's been a lot of progress can be met with further criticism that, oh, well, this isn't what natural human intelligence is. Valid criticisms. And then other things turn out to be very, very hard. And in a way, I regard the general question of making a mind that is a person is an ongoing pursuit of humanity, and it's sort of like imagining humanity is a sculptor whittling away with a chisel at a block of granite, and it's trying to make a picture of the mind, and every time it does something, it takes away something. And so you get good voice recognition, or you get a good chess player, and the response can be, well, that's not really what being a person is. And so I think what we're going to see going forward is a very likely most exciting thing about this era is that going forward, as we try to do this creation, we're either going to find that there are some things that we can't do, in which case we'll be left with a statue that really is a beautiful statue of the ineffable, the irreproducible essence of a mind. Or the other thing, which is what most of the singularity people are confident is going to happen, more and more will be taken away, and in the end we'll be able to do everything, but we're just going to be left with a pile of silicon that is the substrate that we're running mines on that are not an organic substrate. So that's the great question of what the next few years, and really one of the most interesting questions exciting questions that I can imagine.
Hi. I wanted to ask, first of all, I guess the singularity is a big topic for everybody who reads your work. I've read I think all of your books. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about the singularity, just to make sense of it, is asking the question, how far back could you take somebody from 15 years ago, have them read the news for a week and understand what's going on? Or would it be 50 years ago, or would it be 10 years ago? And it strikes me that a lot of days, the big news is stuff that even a random, well-informed person 10 or 15 years ago would have a hard time piecing together. WikiLeaks, what? Anonymous, what? There's something involving computers that makes the markets crash unpredictably sometimes. And I just wonder if that's a good way of looking at the singularity, that as that time gets shorter, it becomes harder to write about the future, but also, even if there's never exactly a superhuman intelligence that arises, you still have the property that you can't talk intelligently about something 50 years ago.
Right. I like to think about putting my mind in the position of somebody 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, and then imagine I'm talking to them and how they would react to here today. And I agree that the farther you go back, the slower you would have to take it. You'd have to sit down and spend an afternoon talking to somebody. I think Mark Twain, if he came to the National Book Festival one afternoon, if he could find sympathetic people to talk to, he'd be up to speed. He'd love it. On the other hand, if he didn't speak English and he was from the Middle Ages, it would take a longer. There's another issue too, and that is you don't have to go back very far before they wouldn't believe you. In other words, they understand what you're saying, but it's just baloney. There's no way that could ever happen. That's all. But they would understand what you're saying. And to me, the fundamental distinction, and a good reason for calling it the singularity, better than talking about infinite blow-ups, the reason for talking about the singularity is this unknowability aspect. You could explain our era to Mark Twain if you could talk to him, I maintain. You could not explain our era to a goldfish. And that's the mental distinction between this form of technological progress and prior great inventions like the printing press or fire or agriculture, which were profound changes, but you could describe them to a listener from before, even if they wouldn't believe you.
Are you worried about the possibility that some people will be able to take advantage of the situation of the singularity and others will be left behind? And what if I want to go on being human, but other people want to be part of the singularity? What would be their advantage of being it? And would I have to be one of the computer's pets then if I didn't want to benefit from it? If I didn't want to have anything to do with it?
One thing about the singularity for real is that in addition to we can't predict ordinary future future when the top of the intellectual pyramid is above human, it's even harder to predict. I suspect that actually it is probably the safest and least catastrophic outcome of the things that could happen in the future. My biggest fear about the future are the moldy oldies like nuclear war. I think that probably the singularity is quite a good outcome for us as humans. In fact, if it was something that was going to happen 100,000 years from now, I think most people, you talk about, oh, good, all these great things happened. Human striving eventually rose up, and we made something better of our human nature. If you look at 100,000 years from now, almost everybody would get a warm and fuzzy feeling about that possibility. If you talk about it as something that's going to happen before you retire from work, then, or before I retire from work, then it becomes much more nervous-making. And I think that's really the reason why it is so nervous-making, is that it is an extreme change. If it would only happen far enough in the future, we'd be quite comfortable with it. I've been given a 2-minute warning here, so I think that means probably go for one more question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good day. Thank you for speaking. In the scenarios, the potential scenarios you laid out that could lead us to the singularity, all of them and the singularity itself are dependent on a technological component, a mechanistic, a computational component. I'd like to ask whether you think there is the potential for genetic enhancement or genetic manipulation to lead us to the point of the singularity without artificial augmentation. Thank you.
I think actually I gave 3 paths to the singularity. I have 2 more standard paths. One is bio enhancement of humanity, which is I think exactly what you mentioned. Yes, I think that's a real possibility. It is technological, but it is a real possibility, and I think actually we will see it. And the other things that involve humans, like the internet plus humans, those are very important because those give us a wedge or a lever into making things happen in ways that actually benefit biological life and ourselves going on. So we're kind of at the ground floor of something that's superhumanly good. We're at the ground floor. We're also in a position to make it be superhumanly good, and things like what you just described and the internet plus people are our chief opportunity to make that go right. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.